question for you. If a black man dies in the forest preserve and no one is around to see it happen, does he still blame the white man? Yo, welcome back to the channel, boys and girls. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about how I gave my Polygon Helios bike a BBL, a facelift, plastic surgery, whatever you want to call it. But I'm going to be talking about how I've upgraded several components on my Polygon bike. I'm going to be talking about some of the price, the weight I saved because I was able to save over 700 grams. I'm going to be talking a little bit on how this bike now performs with these components swapped out, and whether or not you should do this to your bike should you decide to purchase this Polygon Helios A8X bike. So without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so the bike you see in front of you guys, this is my Polygon Helios A8X bike. Shout out to Bikes Online for sending me out this bike to test out and to review. I've had this bike now for a few months. The current price on their website at the time of filming this video is $4,200 USD, and that is for a complete bike. Now, as you guys can see, based on the shapes of the tubes, this is a all-out aero bike, and with the complete bike, I changed it, and I'll talk about this in a minute, but it originally comes with a set of Vision Metron one-piece cockpit, super stiff, very popular. It also comes with a full Ultegra Di2 12-speed. It doesn't include the power meter, which I'll talk about later. Comes with wheels, saddle, everything you need, including spare parts to even put together the bike at home if you choose to not put the bike together at a bike shop. And as you can see, there are several changes that I made on this bike since the original stock setup, and I'm going to be talking about why exactly I made those changes. So let's go ahead and get into all the components I swapped out, and let's also talk about all of the weight I was able to save. Like I said in the introduction of this video, I managed to save over 700 grams over the stock build by upgrading my parts and swapping out several components. First off, let's talk about the front end, this cockpit right here. Now, this was the most important change that I made. Originally, when Bikes Online sent me out this bike to try out, it came with a Vision Metron cockpit. It was like 42 centimeters wide and like 110 millimeter stem. That just doesn't work for me, and unfortunately for myself, in order to really put this bike through its paces, I really needed to set this bike up basically one-to-one to all my other bikes. If you guys have been following my channel recently, you know that I've been on this spree of reviewing bikes. Canyon Air Road, Giant Propel, Tarmac SO8. So it was very important to me to be able to set this bike up, and so I was able to do that by swapping out the cockpit. So I recently featured a video on my channel of this cockpit. So this cockpit is from Tavello, $300. This is their AVRO Gen 1 cockpit. As you guys can see, this is a long boy. So we have 36 millimeters width on the hoods. Extremely comfortable. I'm impressed on how locked in I can feel by going with narrow width on the hoods, and then the stem length is 140. It's very stiff, a little bit of flare in the drops. I think it goes to like 38 centimeters in the drop, but a very sturdy and a relatively affordable cockpit. And with this cockpit alone, I was able to save 60 grams over the existing Vision Metron cockpit. 60 grams on just swapping out the handlebars. Next up, let's talk about some of the components on the drivetrain. So first and foremost, the original cassette that comes from Bikes Online on this Polygon Helios bike, it comes with an 11-34 cassette. Because where I live at in Chicago, it's flat, I don't need the extra climbing gears. So I basically swapped out that 11-34 cassette for an 11-30 cassette, also from Shimano Ultegra, and by swapping out the cassette, I managed to save 54 grams. Continuing on with the drivetrain, not really about weight, but just some of the components I changed. So I swapped in a spider-based power meter. This is courtesy of Magine. This is their PES base power meter. The base components on it retails for $300, and then for an additional like $75, you can swap in their own Magine chain rings as well. Otherwise, you can do Shimano's own chain ring. So we have a 5339 chain ring out front. Very reliable power meter. I've had this also on my Tavello, and when comparing it to my indoor trainer and some of my other power meters, particularly my Quark power meter, very reliable, very accurate. Next up, we have my Nova to Ride oversized pulley wheel. This isn't really for weight, obviously it's probably about the same, but because you have ceramic bearings inside of these jockey wheels, it does make shifting just slightly more crisp It just feels way more smooth when you're turning over the gears. And even though this is very much a marginal savings, you have to understand that making all of these changes together, not any of these particular components and upgrades lives in a vacuum, but in its totality, this is where these marginal savings becomes very significant. And one other thing that I didn't mention because you can't see it is also from Nova to Ride, which, by the way, I do have a discount code for you to save 20%, or excuse me, 10% off of your purchase from Nova to Ride. I'm also rocking a BB86 ceramic bottom bracket. It's a very, very nice bottom bracket, high quality ceramic bearings, and it just makes the crank smooth to turn over the pedals. And because this oversized pulley wheel, because these jockey wheels are oversized, you would typically have to run a longer chain over your stock chain. However, because the original cassette was an 11 to 34, and then I also went up to a 53, by doing all of that, I did not have to make any adjustments to the length of the chain. This is the same exact length that came from Bikes Online for the setup. So it was nice I didn't have to faff around with that. But just keep in mind that typically if you have a stock chain and you're using the same chain ring, you probably have to add, I believe it's 4 chain links to your chain. One other small detail is I am a huge fan of hot wax immersion. As you can see, I don't even have any grime on my hand because this chain is hot wax courtesy of CycloWax. Again, this is another video I've had on this channel. I've done grimy road races using a hot wax immersion system, and even after 65 miles of wet grime and trail races, I'll come back home and there still won't be any grime on the chain because of the hot wax. So I'm a huge fan of it. I hot wax all my chains. Now, the saddle that comes on this bike originally from Bikes Online, it's pretty heavy. And so I opted to swap that out for this S-Works Power carbon railed saddle. I ended up saving like 83 grams just by swapping in this saddle. Sure, it's not the cheapest saddle on the market, but I love the shape on it. It works very well for my sit bones. And again, guys, 83 grams by swapping in a better saddle. Now let's get to the main event, which are these wheels. So the original Entity branded wheels that come on this Polygon, they're like 50 millimeters depth wheels, but they weigh over 1,600 grams. They're like 1,605 grams. That's very heavy for a set of 50 mil wheels, but I do understand and recognize that Bikes Online and Polygon, they are building this bike to a certain price point and spec. So as you guys can see, I have swapped the wheels out for these number 6 45/50 wheels. These wheels are among my top 5 favorite wheels that I've ever tested on the channel. These wheels are sub 1,300 grams. I want to say they're like 1,260 grams. And just by swapping out the wheels, I was able to save, let me look at my notes. I was able to save 333 grams. That's right, guys. 333 grams just by swapping out the wheels. And we haven't even talked about TPU inner tubes. We haven't talked about swapping out the tires, but keeping the theme of the wheels, just some quick specs. I have done a separate video on these wheels, but we have ceramic bearings in the front and rear, carbon bladed spokes, as you can imagine. We have a 36 tooth star ratchet hub engagement. These are the next gen style of hubs. So the carbon bladed spokes, they actually thread into the hubs versus having the side entry installation. And the front wheel is like 28 millimeters internal width. The rear is, I believe it's 25. So like I said, guys, that's right, 333 grams just by swapping out the wheels to a lighter set of high quality wheels. But let's quickly talk about the tires and the inner tubes. So I saved an additional 200 grams. That's right, guys, 200 grams just by swapping the tires over to a set of Continental GP 5000s, as well as going to TPU inner tubes. Now, there will be a little bit of a weight penalty because these are 30C tires versus 28. And because of that wide internal width on these wheels, there is just a little bit of extra volume of air. But nonetheless, you're looking at over 500 grams just by swapping out the wheels, the tires, and switching to TPU inner tubes. So with all of the upgrades I made to this bike, from the cockpit, the wheels, the saddle, a smaller cassette, the grand total of weight I saved is 728 grams total. Again, guys, none of these individual components are really anything of value, or I should say of significance on their own in a vacuum, but in totality, over 700 grams is crazy. So what that does is that brings this bike down for a complete build, including power meter, Garmin mount, and the pedals, That puts this bike down to 7.5 kilograms, which is very respectable. Now, if you were to weigh this bike the industry way, where you remove the power meter, you remove the pedals, you're basically looking at a bike that weighs about 7.1, 7.2 kilograms. And that is very, very respectable, all things considered. As I mentioned earlier, guys, the reason why I made these changes, some of which are significant, is because in order for me to give a proper comparison and review on this bike, to be able to compare it to some of the more premium bikes that I have featured on my channel, I wanted to make sure the components were at least comparable, but especially getting the bike fit dialed in such a way so that I could really put it through my paces. I have done a few of my usual tests, but deep down inside, I knew that unless I could change the front end and the saddle in particular, I knew that I wouldn't be able to give it the deep dive that this bike truly deserves. But now the question becomes, what changes should you make to this bike for yourself? Because everything that I did to this bike will probably run you about $2,000. Now, you'll have to also keep in mind that when you swap out these components, you should be able to sell the wheels that come on this bike. You should also be able to sell that Vision or FSA Metron cockpit as well, because it is a very popular cockpit. And even if you do decide to spend $2,000, that means you're looking in all in $6,200 for the bike you see right now, and that's before selling off some of those stock components. But even at $6,200, you are still, I would say, at least $1,000 cheaper than some of the more premium bikes on the market, especially like the Tarmac SL8. This is a little bit heavier of a frame, but it feels like a tank out on the road. But the components you get are very premium. Like these wheels, the saddle, and definitely the cockpit, these are all components that, even though yes, they are quote unquote a premium, in my opinion, they still are going to be better than the components you're going to get from those bigger premium brands. And again, you're going to be paying $1,000 more over the way this bike is currently set up as you see it today. Just like with the Canyon Aero that I recently featured on this channel, the main criticism that I have with this Polygon Helios bike is the fact that because you are purchasing a complete bike, you are essentially on the hook for making the changes to the bike fit, make an investment in swapping out the components, all that stuff. And so if you are someone that isn't good at doing this work yourself, you will also have to pay a mechanic to make these changes yourself. And this is why for someone like me, this is why I always tend to lean more towards purchasing from brands that offer up a frame set alone option. However, if you are able to optimize your bike fit on this bike, if you are able to swap out important components like the wheels, tires, even switching to TPU inner tubes, this bike absolutely rips. I'm actually surprised of how good this bike feels now that I was able to dial in my bike fit and swap out the wheels especially. And in my opinion, this bike actually feels more like a premium bike than it does a premium bike from one of the Chinese brands. And it's no secret that we have the likes of EJ out on the West Coast. He's racing this bike, absolutely tearing it up. You have some teams, I believe, in Indonesia, some pro teams that are also using this bike. So it's no secret that the frame itself is very, very good. This bike is stiff. It's firm. Even though it's not the lightest frame set that I've ever reviewed on this channel, the benefits of that is the frame just feels like a tank in a good way. It feels so firm and so steady on the road. It doesn't feel like you're going to break this frame over potholes. It just feels like a very, very robust bike. I like a lot of things about this bike, and it's just crazy how just swapping out a few components can make such a dramatic difference on this bike. And while this bike is not the best for climbing, if you live anywhere where it's flat or punchy terrain, this is where this bike really comes alive. It's similar to my Giant Propel, except the wheelbase on this frame is slightly longer, which should, in theory, offer up more control. I'm just impressed of how good this bike is. It's really exciting to ride. One thing I had with my Tevelo Attack frame is while that frame did feel very refined, it didn't feel like some cheap Chinese bike, it wasn't the most exciting bike to ride. This bike, this frame, especially with now I have it set up the way I would with all my other bikes, this bike is exciting to ride. It makes you really want to stomp on the pedals any chance you get, and it just lives at home with wanting to go fast. And that would make sense considering, like I mentioned earlier, this bike is a race bike. I hate to use the word confidence inspiring because that word gets used a lot and who really knows what that means, but as the speeds get higher, This bike is very confident when that pace does kick up. Handling is really predictable and controlled, and just the overall riding dynamics of this bike. It's firm, it's fairly comfortable, does not feel like a noodle, and it feels like it can take a punch and take a beating. So that is going to wrap up today's video, guys. I cannot emphasize how close this bike now feels to the more premium brands on the market with all the upgrades I made on this bike. Once again, huge shout out to Bikes Online for sending me out this Polygon Helios A8X. And be on the lookout in the coming months as I will have a deep dive review on this bike. Questions, comments, and concerns, please feel free to leave them down below. And I will check you guys on the next one. Thank you so much for watching. Peace.